I was a first-year medical student. And Ed looked at me and he said, "So, are you fully committed to just being a mercenary yet?" And I was like, "I get it. I heard this story about drone pilots who were suffering from this thing called moral injury. And I knew that drone pilots didn't actually go into combat, that they lived in their suburban communities, drove onto base in Nevada, flew the drones, drove home, were with their families for dinner. And at that point, I thought, hang on, this sounds really, really like what we're experiencing in healthcare. All right, we've been assessing and addressing burnout for half a century, and we are not making inroads. Do we have the right diagnosis?
If you think veterinarians are just burned out, you're missing the real story. Today on Irreplaceable Truths, we are joined by Dr. Wendy Dean, the physician, thought leader, and co-founder of Moral Injury of Healthcare, who helped reframe the national conversation from burnout to something far more uncomfortable and far more accurate: moral injury. Dr. Dean has spent years challenging the narrative that clinicians are simply exhausted, fragile, or lacking resilience. Instead, she has exposed a harder truth: that many healthcare professionals are being systematically placed in positions where they cannot do what they know is right for their patients. When policies, production pressures, corporate structures, and financial constraints repeatedly force professionals to act against their ethical core, the result is not fatigue, it is injury. And in veterinary medicine, that injury often hides behind phrases like cost of care, client compliance, corporate metrics, compassion fatigue. This conversation goes beyond surface level wellness talk. It dives into identity erosion, systemic betrayal, and what happens when a profession built on care begins to conflict with its own values. If you have ever provided good enough care when you knew what ideal looked like, carried a euthanasia home with you long after the appointment ended, felt that system, not the medicine, is what was breaking you, this episode is for you. Dr. Wendy Dean does not offer cliches, she offers clarity, and clarity is where change begins. Welcome to the conversation the profession can no longer afford to avoid. Welcome to Irreplaceable Truths.
So let's give the listeners a little bit of your background. Obviously, I know your background. I've read your book, loved your book. But you decided, hey, I'm going to go to medical school and be a plastic surgeon. That's where you started.
Well, okay, let's back up a step. So
Okay.
I went to medical school and I was like, I want to be an orthopedic surgeon. But this was the 80s, early 90s. And it was tough as a woman. And so I was like, okay, fine. I'm gonna be a plastic surgeon. Oh, and before that, I thought, oh, I want to be a vet. And then I thought, I can't stand seeing sick animals. Like, it really gets to my heart. But at least people I can talk to and reason through. So went to human medicine, started out wanting to be an orthopedic surgeon, then shifted to general surgery, but then plastics I thought would be really interesting because you had to do a fellowship after your general surgery. But then I realized, if I get out into the world after this fellowship, I'm not going to have much of a life outside of my work. And I am somebody who is sort of relentlessly curious and has a ton of other hobbies. And I just thought that that was not going to work for me. So I left. I went and worked in very rural emergency rooms for a couple of years, thinking, let me get a really broad real life view of what is out there in medicine, what might interest me. And I ended up coming back to do psychiatry, which I had never imagined I might do.
That's interesting because maybe it's just my ignorance, but I always look at, like when you look at urban, suburban type areas, mental health, I believe, is not a faux pas, but I still believe out in the rural areas it is. And you were seeing, was it because you were seeing a lot of issues out there in the emergency rooms with mental health?
So yes, so there were a lot of folks coming through the ER, but it was also that I am sort of I'm like a border collie. I'm like, if I get bored, things get ugly really fast.
Squirrel. Squirrel.
Well, border collies need a job, and if they get bored, they get destructive, right?
Right.
So I psychiatry and the brain were still a big black box, right? Like there was no suggestion that by the end of my career we would have solved that black box and sort of uncovered all its mysteries. So I thought, I am never going to be bored. There's always going to be a question that I can answer. And that was that, and humans are fascinating. Like human behavior is absolutely fascinating. When you put them in groups and the dynamics that happen, even more fascinating. So it really seemed like a place where I could spend a long and curious career.
So you get into psychiatry, and you got in, from what I think I remember from the book, you actually got into a hospital you enjoyed for a little bit, and then everything started to go sideways for you, correct?
Yeah. So my first job, I encountered corporate medicine. And I realized very quickly that practicing psychiatry the way I was trained, the way I came to understand patients would do best, probably wasn't going to be viable in that setting. It was a big sort of corporatized academic practice. And I was in the community group, so I wasn't even doing research. So I thought, I could keep doing this. I could keep fighting this fight and trying to shift this program, but that's probably not going to be very successful. So ultimately, when my husband got a position in a radiology residency, we left and went back to where I had done my surgery residency.
So in the back of your mind, did you think you were always going to be an academician more than a MD, or did you think you were going to balance the two?
So, well, when I was in that big academic practice, balancing clinical work and research was what interested me. When I came to understand what the academic structure was and realized that that was the academic structure in a lot of places, I said, okay, I'm going to give up the investigative piece, right? I'm going to put aside my questions, and I'm just going to go into private practice and commit myself to making patients better, because there's a lot of satisfaction in that. So that's what I did when we went back to New Hampshire for my husband to go to residency.
Okay, so it sounds like, well, you started the traditional path. You had to find yourself. Then you found where you wanted to go. When was the moment that made you start questioning it all?
Okay, so I have a friend who's a physical therapist, and he's about 15 years older than I am. And I knew him before when I was in college. And I went back to visit Ed and his wife, and Ed looked at me, and I was a first year medical student. And Ed looked at me and he said, "So, are you fully committed to just being a mercenary yet?" And I was like, I get it. Like, I get it. So even at the beginning of medical school, I started seeing some hints of things that I wasn't quite comfortable with. I couldn't exactly put my finger on it. It took me decades to be able to actually articulate what I was seeing. but it started really early.
So when he said that, because I think we've talked before, and you said you knew there was a problem, but you couldn't put your finger on it. You were out gardening, right? When you realized that, holy cow, this is what's going on. You were listening to something
Yeah.
about veterans coming back from
Yeah.
Iraq and Afghanistan, if I'm not mistaken. And you're like, holy cow, I think this is what's going on in the human medical field.
Yeah. So that was years later. So I ended up in private practice in psychiatry for about a decade. And when I realized that I either had to go and start just transitioning to a purely prescription practice, which went against everything I believed was right for my patients. I either had to go to the fully prescription practice or I had to leave.
Mm-hmm.
I decided after about a decade of practice that I was going to leave. I thought it was me. I thought I was the one who just couldn't figure out how to make this doctoring thing work. And as I started, I went and worked for the Army, and I was doing some research funding oversight. And as I talked to clinicians across the country in various different specialties, in various different practice structures, I started realizing that it wasn't just me, that a lot of folks were really struggling with how they were being asked to practice. And when I would ask them, "Are you burned out?" almost to a one, it was really eerie how similar the language was. They would say, "Well, I don't feel like that is, I don't feel like that's accurate, but I don't have better language for it." And so that day in my garden, I heard this story about drone pilots who were suffering from this thing called moral injury. And I knew that drone pilots didn't actually go into combat, that they lived in their suburban communities, drove onto base in Nevada, flew the drones, drove home, were with their families for dinner. And at that point, I thought, hang on, this sounds really, really like what we're experiencing in healthcare. And why can't we generalize this language just like we did for PTSD from the military out into a different population? And so that was about 2015-ish. And so then I started really kind of doing the deep dive into, what does this mean? What would this look like in healthcare? What would it look like for the people who are experiencing it?
Yeah. I mean, that's the rabbit hole, right? And anyone who gets into academics, that's the rabbit hole. You start like and it's crazy. Like, you were gardening. Like, for me, I sometimes get these epiphanies when I'm walking my dogs in the morning, or I'm just doing something. It's like when your mind is at ease is when these ideas just pop up in your head. And then, of course, I'm in my 50s now, so if I don't write it down immediately, it's probably gone in a minute. But when I heard the term moral injury, and I heard it from Dr. Philip Richmond, he was talking to me about it, and that's when I went home, and then all of a sudden my light bulb went off, which was, are we overlooking something that is a lot bigger? So can you give the basic definition that you like to use for moral injury?
Yeah. So and I think this is really critical, because one of the things that's happened with burnout is it has become like this junk drawer of awful. So staying true to the definition of moral injury is going to be essential for keeping it as a tightly defined experience. So it is betrayal by a legitimate authority in a high stakes situation that causes you to transgress your deeply held beliefs. And those deeply held beliefs are the promises that we make as professionals to those we serve.
Basically, the oath that we took when we graduated.
Correct.
Yeah. And so I read those words and I was like, holy cow, that's either ownership of the practice or the clients. That's how all of a sudden I was like, It's not client incivility, it's clients having the power. And it seems like, to me, moral injury is always a power struggle. And I feel like on the medicine side, at least veterinarians, a lot of times we're on the losing side.
Go ahead.
Am I wrong to look at it that way?
I think distilling it down to a power struggle is probably oversimplifying it.
Okay.
And I also think that we have to acknowledge that in these difficult fields, whether it's, and we've worked across human medicine, veterinary medicine, law enforcement, lawyers, educators. In all of those, they are difficult jobs. There will be unavoidable moral challenges. Absolutely unavoidable. What we have done a poorer and poorer job of, I think, is preparing students and preparing young professionals to be able to manage those unavoidable moral challenges and to acknowledge them. So when you talk about the client having power over you, yes, I think that if you are employed by a corporation, it is very difficult to be in a situation where they at times don't have to say that they will, you have to acknowledge that they have power over you in some ways. In the client relationship, I think that's a different story. That's very much like our relationships in clinical medicine. Right? And when you start to get into a power struggle with your patient, that's a problem. When you start to get into a power struggle with the parent of a patient, if you're a pediatrician, it's very, that can be a very analogous situation. That breaks down the relationship immediately. And what it suggests to me is that there's something that is not understood, that somehow you're talking at cross purposes. And that better communication strategies or better ways to get past those impasses is essential.
Yeah, because obviously since COVID, at least in veterinary medicine, the cost of care has
same in human
4 times that of inflation.
Yep.
And I know when you and I talked, you're like, well, it's a lot of people don't have insurance. Every single appointment we see, there's always a discussion about a treatment plan so owners know the cost. Every single appointment. It used to be like the client would trust you. They would know that you weren't going to do too much. But now it's like every single time you can go in there and do your physical. You can come back and say, okay, or you tell the client, this is what I want to do. But before you can move on, the client technically needs to see a treatment plan so they know the cost. And, when you recommend something, you're going off of your oath to do, above all, do no harm and make sure you're doing what's best for the patient. But they always seem that and that's kind of, I guess I use the wrong word, but that's where that's where it all starts, in my opinion. They're like, nope, I can't afford this. Let's just euthanize the pet, when you can save that pet.
Right, but do you want to bankrupt the client in order to do that?
Well, that's
right.
a whole different discussion.
But this is exactly what we're facing in human medicine as well. 40% of bankruptcies are caused by medical debt. Financial toxicity is real, whether we're talking about veterinary medicine or human medicine. It's real. There are patients who walk away refusing treatment because they can't afford it or they're afraid to afford it. I mean, when my husband was sick, this is in the book, my husband was desperately ill. I literally had someone come into my husband's room and put a clipboard in front of me and say, we will not transfer him. In other words, we're signing his death warrant unless you sign away your life savings. Because if we transfer him to the Mayo Clinic, there is a chance that the entire bill will be denied by your insurance, and you'll be on the hook for all of it.
So when I had appendicitis, literally I was sitting in the bed, just came back from CT, and I had to give him my credit card to pay my deductible.
Yeah, we were talking $1 million bill.
Wow.
We were talking $1 million. So I was literally talking to our financial planner saying, what will be ruinous? Can I afford this? Can I sign this paper and save my husband? Or will I, and if I do that, will we have to sell our farm? Will my kids not have any more college funds? Like my oldest had just finished his first semester in college. Like it's real out
How
there.
long ago was this?
This is early 2017. Wow. And it's worse now.
Oh, yeah. Don't get me wrong. I think there's a lot of things that are worse now when it comes to medicine, or at least on the veterinary side, because that's where I come from. I think, but in general, I think empathy is gone across the globe. I think that people's values have changed a lot. And unfortunately, I think, the old Wall Street quote that everyone loves, greed is good. And I think at some point, I think the biggest issue we have is that we forget that we're all humans. And, we're supposed to help one another, whether you're a person of faith or not. There's the golden rule, right? And to hear an MD say that she was probably going to have to face bankruptcy because her husband needed treatment shows how effed up the entire system is.
Her husband, who also was a physician,
is a
physician,
radiologist. Yes, sorry,
right? Yeah. I mean, 2 physicians. We can't figure our way out of this mess. Like, come on! If we can't do it, who can? Which is
my wife would have said, "Hey, read the CT and the MRI and the X-rays. We'll save some money there." She'd be going down the bill, see where we could save money. But I love her to death. But that's how she works. So, but your husband's doing okay now?
He's great. Yeah, he's great.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, I mean, Mayo Clinic, is Mayo Clinic like these big, like Cleveland Clinic, Mayo Clinic, MD Anderson, these big, amazing hospitals, are they all having the same issue now too?
With costs?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's only going to get worse if we don't renew the tax incentives, and with the changes in Medicaid, like we are set for a world of hurt.
If your kids came up to you and said, "I wanted," are any of your kids a physician?
No.
What would you have said if they said, "I want to be a doctor"?
So one of them did. My older son for a minute wanted to do it, and I said, "Okay, fine, but you can't just get your MD." And this is for him in particular, right? This, because I said, you can't just assume that the knowledge that you get in medical school is going to be sufficient, both to keep you engaged and to help you understand the landscape of what you're going out into. So you either need a JD with it, or you need an MBA with it, or you need, I think for a kid at his point, with his level of intensity and curiosity, he was going to need more. But he had a hard look at what we were experiencing, and he chose law.
Yeah, he chose law. Yeah, I had, my wife's a full-time vet. I'm a full-time vet. Grandpa is a vet, and our 3 daughters saw what mom and dad and grandpa were going through, and they said, no way.
Yeah.
You know, our middle daughter did broach the subject, but I'm like, okay, the only way I'll let you think about going to veterinary school or support, I'll always support you, but to really support it, you got to get a business degree. And she was looking at me weird, and I'm like, yeah, medicine is business, and
Yeah.
that's a problem. You know, you got to understand how, you know, you keep it really simple, the debits and credits of everything, and you go from there. And you know, once she realized that it was that, because she would then come work with me a few times, and she would listen to the conversations that I would be having with my practice manager and stuff, and it was never about client care.
Right.
Right. It was never about how can we do this better. It was like, okay, how are we going to pay this bill? Oh,
Right.
how much does that cost? You know, because the business side, which is a side that a lot of people do not see, it's dirty, because like hospitals run off a certain thing. And basically it's a lot of, at least in a veterinary hospital, a lot of our charges are based off of what the outside corporations are charging us to do stuff. And, you know, so it's a systemic problem. But that's a whole different talk. That's a whole different business talk. But oh my gosh, that's a whole different, you know, do you think they have moral injury in business? I'm just curious.
So we actually, yes, is the short
Okay.
answer. Yes. I actually have talked to somebody who said to me, they worked for McKinsey for about a year, and then they said they left because of moral injury. They didn't have the language for it at the time, but in retrospect, they realized that's what they were struggling with. I also had a CEO come up to me at one point and say, I see the betrayal. I see how we're betraying our health workers.
And that was just one out of how many are out there.
Well, right. We also have done a study with our collaborator in the UK. Her name's Deborah Morris, and she's fabulous. Looking at executives and managers and their experiences during the pandemic. And about 40% of them experienced moral injury.
Mm. Is that because they were quietly thinking, I can't believe I can't do what's right?
So there were a couple of drivers. One was that they knew what their workforce needed, and they couldn't get it for them, and or they had issues like their values were misaligned with the directives that they were getting from national agencies.
So what happens when someone in power makes you go against your values and morals?
So they don't. Okay, so I want to clarify that perception of betrayal is actually a branch point. So there is a moment. It's like that stimulus and response that Elie Wiesel talks about. So there's a moment after that betrayal when you can stand up and speak out. You can push back. You can call out the betrayal, and you don't have to call it out in a hostile way or a conflict-laden way, because a large part of those betrayals are unintentional. So you can stand up and you can speak out. You can hold your ground, or you can choose to acquiesce. Now, I realize that there are no perfect conditions, and that all of us going into these professions have a boatload of debt, that we have obligations that we have delayed, that there's gratification that we've delayed for a decade. So I'm not saying that the choice to stand up and speak out is an easy one, but there is a choice. And I think we need to be clear about that.
Well, I know the fear of getting fired.
Mm-hmm.
That's there. But do you think, because as I've talked to more and more veterinarians, do you think we are very good at compartmentalizing all this stuff and just keeping it in and just going on with our day, and then it's just a summation effect?
Yeah, I think we're really good at compartmentalizing. I also think we're really good at this unconscious process called betrayal blindness, where because we have those debts, because we have those obligations, because we have family who's counting on us or other coworkers who are counting on us, we cannot allow ourselves to see the betrayal that's happening. And we end up sort of just literally not seeing it until there's one aha moment and you have that epiphany of, oh my gosh, have I been complicit? And then you need to start thinking about, what do I do with that?
Well, if you're known as a whistleblower, good luck getting another job. That's the problem. If you start, right? I mean, unfortunately, because that's the whole. I mean, it's like that's how complex this is, because you said, I have. The bank doesn't care if you have moral injury. Your credit cards don't care if you have moral or injury. Your auto loan doesn't care if you have moral injury. The mortgage doesn't care if you have moral injury. The power company doesn't care if you have moral injury. So you have that on one side. And then on the other side, you have you're beating yourself up inside continuously because you believe you could be doing so much better and so much more good, but you're just like, oh, I guess I can, and it all adds up. It just becomes it's like a vicious cycle. And then, if you do come out and actually finally do say something, you get labeled as the troublemaker or unhireable or whatever, and then that ends up on your HR records. And good luck trying to get another job, because they're going to ask why you're unhireable. I mean,
same thing happens in medicine, in human medicine. And I think, I want to be careful to say that when you stand up and you speak out, that doesn't have to be a hostile act. Again, let's presume there's a book called Trust and Betrayal in the Workplace that suggests that 85% of betrayal in the workplace is unintentional. So if you come at that experience with the presumption of charity, that the person who is that you perceive as betraying you didn't get up in the morning trying to ruin your life or make it miserable, then you can come at that disconnect from a place of curiosity, and to say, hey, I'm not sure you realize what you're doing, what the dynamic looks like here. Here's why I'm having trouble with this directive. Can we think about a different way to do this? Also, knowing that 40% of executives and managers may be experiencing moral injury allows us to say, you know what? We have a place of commonality here. Maybe if we start working from that and understand each other's experience a little bit better, we can move towards better for both of us. But there has to be that willingness to not get into an us versus them battleground.
And because it's unintentional, do you think that's why people are breaking without knowing why?
I think it's a difficult, I think it's a difficult dynamic to admit to. It's a difficult dynamic for those of us on the care side to imagine could happen. And I think it's, it's a complex dynamic. I do think that the language of moral injury is not as common as I would like it to be, so that people understand that there's an additional issue that may be at play here, not just burnout. So, because burnout suggests that it's an individual frailty. Moral injury is very clear that this isn't about you, it's about the system you're being asked to work in. And so understanding that these are two sides of a coin. They often travel together. So if you see one, you should look for the other. They are two distinctly different experiences. But they often go hand in hand.
Well, I mean, let's go down the comparison of burnout and moral injury, because unfortunately my dissertation is looking at, I always thought the biggest problem is that we're not looking at stress correctly in the profession, and that's why we're missing it on burnout. But then, of course, I start reading your book and doing all the research, and now all of a sudden I'm like, this is the issue. One of the biggest issues we have in veterinary medicine is this suicide phenomenon that's going on. Does moral injury lead to more suicide ideation than burnout does?
That's a great question. And in human medicine, we haven't answered that. We haven't done the linkage yet. I mean, keep in mind that burnout has been in the lexicon for more than 50 years. I think it's 50 years this year. No, it's longer than that. Moral injury has been in the lexicon since 2018 in a big way. So we have a lot of catching up to do. Do I think it's associated with some suicidal ideation? Absolutely. I don't know if it's, I can't say for sure with empirical data what the percentage is or whether it's a more important contributor.
Which one do you think is more damaging to the soul, burnout or moral injury?
Well, given that some people define moral injury as a soul wound,
Yeah.
I think that's self-explanatory.
Right. But that's the way you got to look at it, right? It's like, because burnout, and it also depends on how you look at burnout. A lot of people just use emotional exhaustion as burnout, but there's also the concept of, there's you separate yourself from everyone and you have a lack of self-worth. And I can understand how, if you start getting that lack of self-worth piece in your head, you think you're worthless, that can lead to some issues. But I think one of the largest drivers of burnout is moral injury. Would you agree with that one?
No. I would not say that moral injury drives burnout.
Okay.
I don't think they're linked in that way.
You don't think it's a mediator leading to burnout in the path?
No. Do I think that we have misconstrued some of the challenges in burnout, or misconstrued some of burnout when it should have been construed as moral injury? Yes. So I think part of the challenge is that burnout is a very amorphously defined term and experience. And I think when you have 140 definitions for a term, that maybe it has morphed into something that it wasn't intended to be. So I think if we were to be more stringent about how we define burnout and more stringent about how we define moral injury, I think we would start to separate the two and see that there are some drivers of burnout that really properly should be seen as moral injury. Does that make sense?
Yes. So could you give me an example of what someone might say to you? Let's say you're back in practice and they say something to you, and it was someone else that said, "Oh, you're burned out," but it's actually moral injury.
So I think the whole productivity pressure piece. If it's simply that I still feel like I'm providing good care, it just takes me until 7:00 at night to do it, that's burnout. When I say those productivity pressures no longer allow me to take good care of my patients to the standard I would like to, because I simply do not have the time to explain to them what they need, I just have to be a traffic cop, that starts looking like moral injury.
So if someone says to you, I believe I could have done better, that's moral injury?
Well, it could be.
Okay.
Not for sure. It could
Not
be.
for sure. Yeah. I mean, because it's going to be a very sticky, windy road, because ultimately I'm looking at my argument that, my argument has always been that burnout really became a hotbed topic in the early 2000s in the profession. And then after the Great Recession, it became compassion fatigue. And then obviously, unfortunately, during COVID, then we started talking about suicide. But, obviously all this great research that was going on, things, in my opinion, were still going downhill instead of at least plateauing or getting better. So I don't know if we've totally missed the boat. And now everyone in the profession, including the professors that are, these very amazing professors, are teaching students about burnout. Do you think we've completely missed the boat? Do you think we need this moral injury piece in order to right the ship?
Yeah, we do. I don't think we've completely missed the boat, but I do think that we have missed. I often say that burnout is a partial diagnosis. Moral injury is also probably a partial diagnosis. So it's very much like when you are diagnosed with pneumonia and we treat the pneumonia with antibiotics, but you also have a component of bronchospasm, and we failed to treat that.
You forgot the albuterol.
Correct. Correct. And so, but I think that for years we had just said, why isn't this getting better? And that was frankly what I did back in 2015 when I started saying, okay, what am I missing here? There is something I'm missing. And, when you, as a good clinician, you know this, that if you make a diagnosis and you go through two different forms of treatment and the pet isn't getting better, what do? The first thing you do is you question your diagnosis, right? And so that was what I did, is I said, all right, we've been assessing and addressing burnout for half a century, and we are not making inroads. Do we have the right diagnosis?
Can you explain to people what the eternal experience of moral injury feels like?
So I think it feels a little bit different for different people, but it can feel like shame. Anger is very typical in healthcare. Frustration, and you feel like what the distinction I make between things like moral distress and moral injury is you go from saying I'm distraught because I can't provide the care that I would like, that I know is possible, to I'm wondering if I can still be the good person I think of myself as, the good doctor I think of myself as, if I continue to provide care like this.
And see, right there, that's that lack of self-worth. And that's why I think these two different constructs are getting confused.
And I'm not even sure that I would call it a lack of self-worth. I think it is a sort of a qualitatively different thing. Can I continue to think of myself as the good doctor I imagined I would be? So it's like the difference between the ideal and the real. And it's not I'm not a good person, it's I'm not a good professional.